Nathan parked the decoy vehicle deep in the back lot of an abandoned auto repair shop 15 miles out of town. The kind of place that hadn't seen movement in years and wouldn't attract attention unless someone already knew he was there. He sat still for almost an hour, eyes scanning the surroundings, mind racing through the list of possibilities. Someone had sold him out. He'd known for years it was inevitable people like him didn't get to ride off into quiet retirements in peaceful neighborhoods, but he'd hoped to buy more time, just enough to fade beneath the radar. But this, a rogue black bag unit operating under the guise of federal clearance, that wasn't just a cleanup job, that was a full erasure. Someone high enough had decided he was a liability, and that meant they wouldn't stop until he was either detained, reconditioned, or dead. But if they thought he was going to run blindly, they'd forgotten who he used to be. Nathan had spent years operating inside hostile territories under layers of aliases, building networks with nothing but scraps, and surviving more complex traps than this one. And now, those skills were no longer a contingency, they were necessary. He opened the secured briefcase from the trunk and pulled out a satellite phone connected through a non-standard encryption protocol. A few minutes later, he was patched through to an old contact known only as Monroe, a ghost himself, buried deep within a different government cell that specialized in counterintelligence. Monroe didn't ask for pleasantries. "You've been tagged groups operating under Eclipse directive out of Langley, but answers to no one. Third-party funded domestic ops disguised as federal authorizations." Nathan clenched his jaw. "What's the trigger?" A pause. Then Monroe answered, voice lower. "Project Meridian. They're tying up loose ends." Nathan's stomach dropped. Meridian wasn't just another black project. It was the last classified operation he had participated in before going under. A covert sting involving a stolen nuclear microreactor, a foreign power, and a mole so high up in the chain that its exposure could have triggered diplomatic war. They'd sealed the files, vanished the records, and extracted the witnesses. Won him. He wasn't just a threat, he was the key, Monroe continued. "There's a digital dead drop you left 5 years ago in case you got burned. We need that file. If you can get it to me, we can bring this whole thing into light. But you need to make it back into your house. That's where the drive is." Nathan looked down at his hands. The neighborhood he'd have to go back, and it wasn't just a risk to himself, it was a risk to everyone there. He thought of Lisa, the neighbors, the kids laughing around there, inflatable slides, unaware of the invisible warfare happening in the periphery of their lives. The rogue agents had made one mistake. They'd underestimated his attachment. He wasn't just fighting to survive now, he was fighting for every innocent person who would get caught in the blast radius if this operation didn't end cleanly. That night, using backwoods and fire roads, Nathan returned to the outskirts of Westbrook Ridge. He parked in a maintenance tunnel used by the county's electric division, cut through the drainage system, and emerged beneath the foundation of his own home through a hidden access panel sealed under his backyard compost bin. Inside, everything was quiet. His internal cameras told him the house hadn't been breached yet, but the perimeter was active. 2 agents outside, 1 car parked 3 houses down, and a spotter drone circling at a wide distance. They weren't expecting him back tonight. That was their second mistake. He moved quickly but silently through the house, accessing the crawl space beneath the floorboards of his master bedroom. Inside a sealed compartment was a small steel cylinder, smooth, cold, and weightless except for the information it carried. A 256-bit encrypted drive, with files that could dismantle the entire Eclipse operation. But extraction was the hard part. If he left now, he'd be seen. If he stayed, he'd be cornered. So, he played the last card in his deck: chaos. Nathan initiated a fake emergency signal from one of the HOA's public emergency beacons, one he had quietly rewired months earlier, as a failsafe. Within 2 minutes, the local emergency dispatch sent out alerts for a gas leak originating from a home 2 blocks away. Sirens lit up in the distance. Police cars, fire trucks, and medical teams descended on the neighborhood with urgency, completely blindsiding the Eclipse unit. The agents scattered into cover positions, unsure if the leak was real or part of an ambush. Nathan used the confusion to slip out in a landscaping van parked behind his own garage, swapping uniforms and identities on the fly. He was gone before they realized the leak was a lie. He delivered the drive to Monroe at a secure airstrip 5 hours later, after crossing state lines and passing through 3 identity scrambles. The files were transferred, duplicated, and sent to 4 international press contacts, 3 internal affairs divisions, and 1 congressional oversight committee. Within 48 hours, Project Meridian no longer existed in the shadows. It was global news. Headlines exploded. Rogue intelligence cell uncovered. Classified operation tied to domestic infiltration. Whistleblower exposes government-backed assassination list. Names were named, careers were ended. The Eclipse unit dissolved into the wind, its operators either disappearing or being reassigned to non-operational posts. And Nathan Cole, he was declared dead in a private federal file, cause of death unknown, body unrecovered. But back in Westbrook Ridge, things slowly returned to normal, though a quiet weight remained in the atmosphere. Lisa watched the news, in disbelief, piecing together what she could. never quite confirming the truth, but deep down knowing exactly what Nathan had done. The neighborhood recovered. The fair resumed the following month, and a new family moved into Nathan's old home, a young couple with no history, no ties, and a dog that didn't bark. But Lisa noticed something peculiar during a routine HOA meeting. A new camera had been installed across the street, attached to the light post, not city-issued, not HOA registered. It faced the neighborhood calmly, passively, almost protectively. And inside the camera casing, hidden beneath layers of encrypted hardware, a single line of code kept running. Operation Guardian. Active. Nathan may have vanished, but his eyes never closed. Nathan stood inside his home for several minutes after locking the door. The message still glowing on the screen of his secure device, its brief but urgent wording already igniting every trained instinct in his mind. New target proximity confirmed. That meant someone, or something, close. Too close. His fingers moved with methodical calm as he secured the device in a hidden compartment under the floorboard near the hallway vent, then walked to his office, an unremarkable space to any ordinary eye, but a fortified command center behind its ordinary bookshelves and filing cabinets. With a quick sequence of inputs on the concealed keypad beneath his desk, a wall panel clicked open to reveal multiple screens, encrypted communications modules, and access terminals. One of the screens displayed a neighborhood grid, each home tagged and color-coded with resident data, behavior flags, and movement logs. Geraldine's residence, now dark for weeks, remained marked in red, not because she was still a threat, but because he didn't trust that the government facility would hold her forever. People like her found ways to come back, but she wasn't his concern now. The new threat was unknown. The system's facial recognition software had triggered on a man posing as a property inspector, seen briefly in front of 98 Briar Elm Lane. He wore the uniform, carried the badge, had the right clipboard, but Nathan's surveillance caught a subtle discrepancy. His badge number didn't exist in the city's inspector database. And more importantly, his eyes swept the neighborhood like a trained observer, not someone interested in lawn code violations. The man was too casual, too rehearsed. Nathan's AI log had flagged the incident as high anomaly. That wasn't something to take lightly. He rewound the footage 3 times, isolating the man's gait, his stance, even the way he held his pen. Military, probably special ops. Nathan had seen those exact movements before in mirrors. If they were watching him now, it meant either a counter-op was in place, or his previous mission had attracted too much heat. Either way, he couldn't afford to wait. He activated the secondary alert protocol, which sent encrypted pings to 2 field contacts stationed in different parts of the region. Both responded within the hour, one confirming that a similar inspector had been seen near a federal safe house in upstate Oregon. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was combing through the network, and Nathan's quiet life in Westbrook Ridge was no longer a cloak. That night, he didn't sleep. He rerouted power through an isolated generator, blacked out his smart meter feed, and initiated a dummy traffic signal on all his outbound internet nodes to simulate non-activity. The entire house went dark on public records, as though he didn't exist. From the outside it looked like he was simply on vacation, but inside, his sensors were wide awake. Meanwhile, Lisa and the HOA board continued with their plans for the neighborhood's upcoming summer fair. It had been years since the community had felt secure enough to host an actual gathering. Bouncy houses, food trucks, local musicians. It was all meant to heal the past few years of paranoia and Geraldine's suffocating reign. Lisa was proud of what they'd accomplished, but even she noticed something unsettling as she reviewed the vendor permits. One of the newly submitted food trucks had no prior service record. The applicant listed their name as Derek Palmer, but the background check came back blank, not flagged, not failed, just empty, as if the person didn't exist before the application date. She chalked it up to a clerical error and moved on, but the unease lingered in her mind. On the day of the fair, Nathan stood across the street behind tinted windows, watching as families gathered, laughter echoed, and balloons bobbed above lemonade stands. He scanned every guest, every volunteer, every vehicle. Then he saw him, the inspector, this time wearing sunglasses, blending into the crowd by pretending to check the setup of a portable generator. He even waved at Lisa, who, recognizing him from the inspection weeks ago, waved back with a polite smile. Nathan's jaw clenched. The man was now inside his web. The plan had escalated. But why? Why so public? Why here? Unless this wasn't about surveillance anymore, maybe it was a trap. Nathan's instinct screamed at him to act, but every part of his training also told him to wait, to observe. That patience paid off within 20 minutes. As the inspector made his way toward the back corner of the event where the electrical hubs were stationed, Nathan noticed a second man, same build, same sunglasses, different angle. They weren't watching the neighborhood, they were watching each other. That meant coordination. This wasn't just a routine sweep. Nathan pulled out a small encrypted device from his pocket, no larger than a key fob, and pressed twice. A series of hidden camera feeds activated across the fairgrounds, pulling live footage from small nodes he had embedded during routine jogs over the past 6 months. Within moments, he had eyes on all 4 corners. 2 more, Men, one near the restroom trailers, another near the inflatables. They weren't interacting, they weren't eating, they weren't part of the crowd, they were monitoring it. Nathan's heart rate slowed, but his focus intensified. He knew what this was now, a blackout net. A coordinated sting designed to isolate a single target and extract them without public panic. And from their pattern, he was that target. Why now? Why expose themselves here? That's when he saw Lisa, one of the men with a clipboard, probably confirming generator logistics. The man spoke to her briefly, then reached into his pocket. Nathan's stomach turned cold. It wasn't a gun, it was a badge. She nodded, confused but unalarmed, then walked away. That was the confirmation. These men were sanctioned, which meant Nathan had been burned. A mole inside the agency had outed him. It wasn't about the neighborhood anymore, it was about his past. He moved, not with panic, but with precision. He exited through a side hatch beneath his garage, dressed in a volunteer shirt and hat he had prepared for an emergency egress scenario. No one looked twice as he merged with the crowd and walked calmly toward the eastern parking lot. From a distance he watched as the 4 agents began shifting positions, closing a square perimeter toward his home. They didn't know he had already left. Nathan crossed the street, 3 blocks down, entered a vehicle registered under a shell name, and pulled away without headlights. His phone vibrated once, a single word. Message, run. It was from his regional contact. They had confirmation. Extraction unit was a black bag team gone rogue, operating under the guise of federal clearance but working for a private entity. The target Nathan and the reason, unknown. Nathan drove for 30 miles without stopping, eyes on the rearview mirror, mind calculating. He wasn't safe anymore, not here, not in Westbrook Ridge. But he also couldn't just disappear, not until he figured out who had turned on him, and certainly not until he cleaned up the mess that could still follow him back to the community he had, despite everything, begun to care about. Because even though he'd been a ghost living among civilians, Westbrook Ridge had become more than cover. It had become real. And he wasn't going to let his past destroy that, not without a fight. Summer's heat bore down on Westbrook Ridge, drawing children out onto sidewalks with popsicles and laughter, their voices echoing through the neatly maintained streets that once felt like prison walls under Geraldine's gaze. But now, life had returned, vibrant and free, with weekend BBQs, early morning joggers, and neighbors who actually smiled at each other. The absence of Geraldine's wrath had given the community room to breathe. Yet even amid this newfound harmony, a silent awareness remained, a mutual, unspoken understanding that across the street, inside the now darkened colonial with the white columns and rotting gardenias, lived a woman unraveling from the inside out. Geraldine had become a ghost in her own home, wandering from room to room with curtains drawn and lights dimmed, her eyes red from sleepless nights and her fingers twitching from invisible stimuli. Every noise, every flicker, every device's subtle hum made her jump. She kept her TV on mute, her radio disconnected, and even removed the light bulbs from her ceiling fans after convincing herself that they were listening. A once regal woman who had run neighborhood meetings with manicured authority now sat barefoot, in threadbare pajamas at her dining table, obsessively scribbling gibberish on legal pad symbols, timelines, patterns, fragments of ideas connected by paranoia instead of logic. Nathan Cole, meanwhile, was now something of a myth. Though few people ever saw him during the day, his name still surfaced in whispers anytime something unusual happened. When a break-in was prevented 2 blocks over, residents claimed they saw an unmarked SUV tailing the suspects. When a stolen car was recovered within minutes of being abandoned on Oak Ridge Drive, someone swore they saw Nathan walking his German Shepherd near the scene. Of course, Nathan never acknowledged any of it. He simply lived, quiet and distant, never rude, always brief. To most, he was just a neighbor who kept to himself, but to Geraldine, he was the shadow under her bed, the signal in her walls, the eye in the sky. She hadn't left her property in over a month. Delivery drivers left her packages 10 feet from the door at her request, and her trash bins never moved from the garage anymore. She ate canned soup straight from the tin, survived on bottled water, and spoke to no one, not even her sister, whose worried voicemail stacked up unanswered. But the worst part wasn't the isolation, it was the certainty. Geraldine was convinced she was being watched, not just by Nathan, but by everyone. She believed the HOA had turned on her completely, that Lisa had been compromised, and that Nathan had installed something in her home the night she fainted. Every vent, every outlet, every crack in the drywall became a potential conduit. She began dismantling her walls, pulling down insulation with her bare hands. When she broke open the living room's crown molding and found a black wire, she screamed, only to realize it was part of the old sound system she herself had installed years ago. Her mind, once sharp and scheming, had splintered. But even in this decayed state, one sliver of her old self clung to hope. She believed that if she could collect undeniable proof of Nathan's surveillance, she could redeem herself. Not to the HOA, not even to the authorities, but to herself. She dug out her old equipment, set up makeshift signal detectors, thermal readers, and electromagnetic scanners all over the house. Every beep, every fluctuation in signal strength, every spike on her screen confirmed what she already believed, that Nathan was sending something into her home. something beyond technology. She scribbled these findings into journals she kept hidden under the floorboards. Meanwhile, Lisa and the new HOA board were beginning to worry. Rumors about Geraldine's condition had started spreading among the neighbors. Some claimed they heard her shouting through the walls at night. Others swore they saw her digging in the backyard with a broken rake, and one resident said he saw her standing in the middle of the street at 3 a.m., motionless, staring at Nathan's house. Lisa, driven partly by guilt and partly by responsibility, decided to check in on her. One quiet Sunday afternoon, she walked up to Geraldine's porch with a homemade casserole and knocked gently. No answer. She knocked again, louder, still nothing. But just as she turned to leave, the door creaked open an inch. Geraldine's eye peered through the crack, wild and bloodshot. "I didn't call for help," she hissed. Lisa tried to speak kindly, offered the food, asked if she was okay. But Geraldine responded only with mutters about signal warfare and false identities. Lisa left the dish on the porch and stepped away, heart heavy. Later that night, the casserole dish flew across the street and shattered on the sidewalk in front of Lisa's house. It was clear Geraldine didn't want help, but help was coming whether she wanted it or not. Nathan had been documenting her behavior for weeks. He had files, time-stamped footage, audio logs, intercepted radio frequencies, and mental health deterioration indicators all neatly catalogued. He wasn't just watching her, he was preparing, not for retaliation, but for containment. Geraldine had escalated from a neighborhood nuisance to a psychological risk, and as someone involved in classified operations, Nathan could no longer allow her instability to spiral unchecked. That week he made a discreet call, not to local authorities but to a private agency contracted by the federal government to handle sensitive domestic disturbances involving classified personnel. Within 3 days, a team arrived not in sirens and uniforms but in khakis and polos, clipboard-carrying social workers and wellness officers with well-rehearsed smiles. They claimed to be from a community outreach organization and approached Geraldine under the guise of a routine wellness check. She screamed when they knocked, refused to let them in, and threatened to burn down her own house if they stepped onto her lawn. For 2 hours, they tried to reason with her until finally, a supervisor made a quiet call, and an emergency intervention was authorized. A team in unmarked gear swept in with tranquil precision, safely sedated her, and escorted her to a secure facility. It wasn't jail. It wasn't even a hospital. It was a holding center designed for individuals who posed indirect threats to national security through psychological breakdown. The official report listed her as mentally unfit for public integration and recommended long-term psychiatric rehabilitation. And just like that, Geraldine Stokes vanished from Westbrook Ridge without a single scream or protest. The neighbors were told she had moved to be closer to family. Lisa told anyone who asked that Geraldine had chosen to take some time off from neighborhood life. No one really wanted the truth, and no one asked too many questions. They were just glad the nightmare was over. Nathan, on the other hand, erased every trace of the incident from his surveillance logs. He wiped the drives, reset the protocols, and adjusted the angles of his cameras to face the public roads again. He returned to his walks with the German Shepherd, his quiet routines, and his unreadable expressions. But behind those sharp eyes was a new level of alertness. He knew Geraldine was just one of many. People who couldn't leave well enough alone. People who saw shadows where there were none. People who stumbled too close to things they weren't meant to understand. And as he stood on his porch that evening, watching the sunset over the ridge, he knew the peace wouldn't last forever. It never did. He received a secure message on his burner device. One line only. New target proximity confirmed. Without a word, he turned, stepped inside, and locked the door. The ambulance that arrived to revive Geraldine was greeted by a crowd of curious neighbors who had been quietly observing the unmarked cars outside her house, their phones discreetly pointed through blinds and from behind garden hedges. As paramedics tended to her limp body, murmurs spread like wildfire through the cul-de-sac. People who once feared Geraldine's power now whispered with glee at the sight of her being loaded into a stretcher, her hair disheveled, her skirt dirtied from the grass, and the once mighty clipboard abandoned in a flower bed like a broken badge of false authority. Nathan stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching silently without an ounce of emotion. He knew this kind of neighbor, wealthy, overzealous, suburban tyrant, hungry for control, unwilling to see where the real power resided. After the ambulance pulled away, the neighborhood exhaled. No one spoke of the incident openly, but the tension in the air evaporated like a summer storm. For the first time in years, the residents of Westbrook Ridge felt like they weren't walking on eggshells anymore. Geraldine was released the next morning under observation but returned home to a street that no longer welcomed her. Mailboxes were no longer her jurisdiction. Garden decor no longer her battle. For the first few days, she stayed inside, curtains drawn, blinds closed, windows covered with thick sheets. Her usual HOA circulars and violation notices never resumed, and the silence from her home was louder than ever. However, silence didn't mean surrender. Inside, Geraldine had turned her obsession into a mission. If Nathan Cole was part of something secret, She would expose it even if it meant playing a longer game. Her paranoia morphed into an obsession darker than before. She began researching surveillance technology, learning about frequency jammers, thermal sensors, and night vision drones. She ordered equipment online under her sister's name and converted her attic into a makeshift observation den. She even managed to hack into Nathan's Wi-Fi. At least she thought she did, using tools from a shady website she discovered on a conspiracy forum. What she didn't realize was that her every move was being tracked, not by Nathan, but by federal systems that recognized patterns of amateur interference with encrypted intelligence networks. She wasn't just watching anymore, she had crossed a line. Meanwhile, Nathan continued his carefully calculated routine. He left home at odd hours, returned at stranger ones, always in a different car or sometimes not at all for days. Packages arrived that no one could identify, and the only people who ever seen entering his home were men with military postures and briefcases that were never opened outside. Lisa from the HOA office, who had recently become more vocal since Geraldine's downfall, told a few neighbors that the HOA board had received private assurance from a secured apartment that Nathan was not only fully compliant, but also acting in the best interest of the neighborhood. It was clear Nathan wasn't just a resident, he was protection. But for Geraldine, none of that mattered. In her mind, she wasn't wrong, just unproven. So when she noticed two men in suits loading hard cases into Nathan's garage late one Thursday evening, she took action. She activated a spy drone she had purchased illegally online and flew it from her backyard over the rooftops until it hovered above his driveway. Her plan was to capture photographic proof, some kind of concrete image she could send anonymously to the press. But the moment her drone passed over Nathan's backyard, the signal was cut. It didn't crash, it simply froze mid-air and descended gently as if being pulled by an invisible string. 10 minutes later, there was a knock at her door. Two men, in black suits, this time not from local police, presented themselves without introduction. One held her drone in his hand. "This belongs to you," he asked plainly. Geraldine, caught off guard and trembling, tried to lie, but they already knew. They didn't arrest her, nor did they threaten her. Instead, they issued one final warning. She had 24 hours to shut down all unauthorized surveillance equipment or she would face charges under federal espionage laws. It was the first time she understood the magnitude of what she'd been tampering with. After they left, she paced her living room for hours, her mind oscillating between fear and indignation. Somewhere inside, her conscience whispered that maybe this time she had gone too far. But that voice was silenced by the louder roar of pride, the belief that she was defending the neighborhood from a potential threat, even if no one else saw it. She didn't sleep that night. She began printing every file, screenshot, and log she had gathered over the past few weeks, compiling it all into a thick binder labeled Operation Lawn Watch. She planned to take it to the mayor's office the next morning, but Nathan was always one step ahead. Before sunrise, a quiet black car pulled into her driveway. A single envelope was left at her doorstep, no return address. Inside was a photograph of her taken the night before through her attic window, holding the controller of her drone. On the back of the photo were two words handwritten in capital letters: "Stop now." Her hands shook. Geraldine wasn't just being watched, she was being tolerated, momentarily, by people who could end her life with a phone call if they wanted. For the first time, she understood what fear actually felt like, not the kind she instilled in others, but real bone-deep dread. That morning she packed away all her equipment, erased her hard drives, and threw the binder into her fireplace. She called Lisa and resigned from every self-appointed position she had in the HOA. She even wrote a note never sent to Nathan apologizing for the misunderstandings, but it was too late. The damage had been done, not just to her reputation, but to something deeper, her mind. Geraldine began to isolate herself entirely. The woman who once strutted the sidewalks with power now shuffled to her mailbox in slippers, avoiding eye contact. She refused guests. She removed herself from all community chats. And, slowly, the neighborhood adjusted. The HOA, now led by Lisa and a new board, thrived without Geraldine's interference. Block parties returned. Kids played in front yards again. Neighbors greeted each other with ease. And Nathan, he remained the same, quiet, observant, unfazed. But if anyone looked closely, they'd see that the angle of his cameras had changed. They no longer focused outward toward the street. Now, one camera faced Geraldine's home directly, always watching, always recording. As spring turned into summer, Geraldine began hearing things at night: low hums, soft clicks, the faint crackle of radio frequencies that no one else could hear. She tried to ignore it at first, blaming stress or the wind, but soon the sounds were everywhere, in her walls, in her vents, in her dreams. She believed Nathan was transmitting something directly into her home. She taped over every light and crack. She lined her windows with aluminum foil. She wore earplugs to sleep and built a tinfoil hat she insisted was medically necessary. The neighbors began to whisper again, not with fear, but pity. The once feared HOA tyrant had become the strange woman across the street who talked to invisible machines. Her downfall wasn't loud, it was quiet, stretched over days and weeks. A slow unraveling of pride, paranoia, and isolation. And through it all, Nathan watched, his face unreadable, his motives still unknown. But one thing was certain: Geraldine Stokes had chosen the wrong man to battle, and while she may have believed she started a war, she never realized she had lost it before it even began. The morning air in Westbrook Ridge was always crisp and carried the scent of freshly cut lawns and blooming hydrangeas, the kind of place where everything looked postcard perfect until you scratched beneath the surface. In this pristine, gated community of oversized homes and manicured hedges lived a woman who believed she ran it all: Geraldine Stokes. Geraldine wasn't officially elected to lead the Homeowners Association, but somehow she had infiltrated every committee, every mailbox, every neighbor's business with such persistence that most gave up resisting her. With her blonde bob navy skirt suits and stilettos that clicked like a gavel on pavement, she walked the sidewalks like a judge presiding over her domain. She took pride in enforcing rules most people didn't even know existed, from the exact shade of white allowed on porch railings to the number of decorative pumpkins permissible per household during Halloween. Her home had multiple surveillance cameras, not to protect her property, but to observe others. People whispered that Geraldine didn't sleep, she just recharged. Then came the day someone moved into 112 Cedar Maple Lane, a charming two nestled at the cul-de-sac which had been vacant for nearly 8 months. The moving truck arrived before dawn, and by noon the blinds were already drawn. The man who owned it was tall, quiet, and striking in a way that suggested control and mystery. His name, according to the lease records Geraldine immediately pulled from her contacts, was Nathan Cole. No family, no partner, no pet, just him and a German-engineered SUV without tough state plates. What bothered Geraldine most wasn't the quietness, it was the unknown. Nathan didn't show up to the HOA welcome brunch. He didn't respond to her clipboard notices. Worst of all, he installed security cameras, 3 of them on the front corners of his house. One even pointed toward the street, in direct view of Geraldine's house across the road. To her, that was an act of war. She confronted him on a Tuesday afternoon, dressed in her tailored best, clipboard in hand. Nathan answered the door with a disinterested look and let her speak uninterrupted for almost 5 minutes before responding in a calm, deliberate tone that made her skin crawl. "This conversation is being recorded. Kindly step off my property." That night, she filed her first official HOA complaint, citing unauthorized surveillance equipment, non-compliance with community visibility standards, and refusal to cooperate with established neighborhood decorum. But when she checked the association's system 2 days later, the report was gone, removed, dismissed. Furious, she went door to door gathering support from neighbors, most of whom reluctantly signed her petition just to shut her up. But something strange was happening. While Geraldine stirred drama, Nathan kept a low profile, but odd things were being noticed. Packages that had gone missing on the block were now being found returned on porches. A known porch pirate in a neighboring district was arrested, and Geraldine swore she saw unmarked vehicles parked near Nathan's house late at night. She began obsessing over his schedule, tracking his comings and goings in a handwritten log she stored under her bed. When Nathan's trash bins were out an hour too early, she called the city. When his front yard light stayed on past the community curfew, she filed a violation, but every one of her complaints disappeared without a trace. It was as if Nathan was untouchable. She started photographing him from her living room window, logging license plates of visitors, and even installed a directional microphone through her open garage just to catch any conversations. Then came the day she heard something that would ignite her paranoia like gasoline on fire. From across the cul-de-sac, her directional mic picked up Nathan on a phone call. The words "surveillance," "intercepted comms," and "target patterns" were clear as day. Her face paled. She immediately interpreted this as evidence of something sinister, a cybercriminal, maybe a spy. That night, she submitted an anonymous tip to the police, reporting Nathan for suspicious activity. But when the officers arrived, Nathan didn't even look surprised. He calmly welcomed them in, provided documents, and within 15 minutes, the officers left, this time with apologetic nods. Geraldine stood across the street fuming, watching the whole thing from behind her curtain. The officers wouldn't even tell her what they found, saying only that Mr. Cole is cooperating fully and is not a concern. That wasn't enough for her. She called 911 3 more times over the next week, each with more elaborate accusations. "He's broadcasting radio waves that interfere with aircraft. I saw strange men leaving his garage with briefcases. He has a satellite dish disguised as a lawn ornament." But every time the visits were short, the officers polite, and the outcomes not threatening. And then, her worst nightmare unfolded. She received a formal warning, not him. The city notified her that repeated false emergency reports could result in legal action. Furious, she stormed to the HOA office, demanding that Nathan be evicted or at least penalized. The new HOA coordinator, young woman named Lisa, appointed by the board, flatly informed her that Nathan was in compliance with all regulations. And furthermore, his cameras had recently helped law enforcement identify a fugitive who had passed through the neighborhood. Geraldine's hands trembled as she walked back to her home. She'd lost control. and she knew it. Her usual weapons, gossip, petty policy, were useless against him. But she wasn't done. The next day, she called the local news anonymously and claimed a federal investigation was being covered up by the HOA. Her story didn't get picked up, but it did attract attention from another agency, one she didn't expect. That night, unmarked vehicles returned, this time parking outside her house. Men in dark suits asked her to come outside. They presented her with a sealed federal document. It informed her that she had been surveilling a protected federal operative and that her actions, documented through her own audio recordings, photos, and trespassing attempts, constituted interference with an active federal investigation. She had two choices: seesaw monitoring, submit a formal apology to the HOA and to Nathan Cole, or face legal consequences. Geraldine fainted right there on her front lawn, her clipboard flying from her hands and landing in the bushes.